Hi, we complete Revelation 19 today with the great supper of God and the eating of the flesh of kings and of captains of the mighty. So what are we going to make of these things? Well, to enter into it, we're going to continue to look at some of the questions raised in Revelation 19 and 20, as we've been doing the last few videos. If you haven't watched the introductory video for these two chapters and you're not that familiar with them, I would really encourage you to do so to get some framework for the details we'll look at here. So we've been working our way through these, and we looked at number 1 and 2 last time. So if you have questions about that, I invite you to watch the last video. We also have looked at how these chapters echo and anticipate other parts of Revelation, and we'll look a little more about that today. But we're going to really focus, as we've been doing, especially now, on the echoes of Hebrew Scripture today in this passage, and especially on the role of Ezekiel, not just in individual echoes of words or phrases, but the entire structure at the end of Ezekiel that John is plainly using in structuring the end of Revelation. And then in this question here, both from the last video and this one, what is the relationship between the marriage supper of the Lamb in 19:9 and the great supper of God in 19:17 and 18? And then how do the war scenes here relate to the ones in 13? The rest of these relate to chapter 20, and we'll deal with those next time. So something about Ezekiel. Let's consider if you were John on the island of Patmos for whatever reason, whether, as we looked in the beginning, whether you're there because the Roman Empire exiled you there, or you're there, as John claims, and witnessing to Jesus to the people on that island where there was a penal colony. So we don't know if John was in the penal colony or perhaps ministering to people in the penal colony, or the people who worked at the penal colony, or otherwise. But in any event, if you're on Patmos, you're a follower of Jesus, you might well feel like Ezekiel did, that you're in exile in a foreign land. That you believe in the God who's the creator and has chosen your people to be an example for others, and yet here you are subject to empire and suffering greatly, as we see throughout this book. Both, and not just the suffering because of persecution, but the suffering because of the challenge of staying firm to a vision that's not the vision that the people around you have. And we certainly know that in our era, whether you're on the left or on the right, of how hard it is to hold your vision if you're surrounded by people who hold the opposite vision, when conversation between them seems impossible. So Ezekiel and John were in similar situations. Ezekiel explicitly writing from Babylon in the middle of the exile, and visioning in the first part of his book, God speaking to the exiles about why the exile was their own fault. And in the last part that we're going to be looking at today, from Ezekiel 36 through the end of the book in chapter 48, providing a new start and a new vision. And so similarly, John here on Patmos sees the end of empire and the scenes that we're going to see here in the destruction, although he doesn't blame God's people for it as Ezekiel does. And then we'll see the replacement with a new Jerusalem. So there are many similarities there. Let's look at some of the details in the passages we see from Ezekiel 36 onward, and why John might have seen Ezekiel as a nice template for him to work with, although he makes some important changes, and that's what we'll see as we look through this. And then consult Revelation for the differences. So Ezekiel 36 starts with a recreation after all the oracles of destruction and painful oracles about the evils of Israel, likened to a street prostitute. Now Ezekiel's embodying the God, Yahweh, the part of Yahweh that is merciful and tender and caring. And so we see in this first part not so much something that John echoes in Revelation, but Ezekiel's echoing in from Genesis 1 to 3. And if you watch my Genesis videos or not, you may be aware that many scholars have now shifted from the older view of Wellhouse and others that saw these early stories of Genesis, Genesis 1, as being a priestly story, perhaps from exile, but the Garden of Eden story being from the supposed Solomonic Enlightenment period, authored by the Yahwist. Almost all serious scholars have abandoned that view now and see all of Genesis either exilic or post-exilic, perhaps in the Persian period or even later, which is to say that Ezekiel's vision here in Ezekiel 36 and the authors of Genesis in Genesis 1 to 3 may well have been written at the same time. They may well have been exiled together and consulted. And in fact, as we see here, the mention of the Garden of Eden in Ezekiel 36:35, it was in only 2 places it's mentioned outside of Genesis in the Hebrew Scripture, and the other is in the book of Joel. So certainly Ezekiel, we know, has Genesis before him here. Let's just look at a few of the images here that he provides and how it echoes from Genesis, but it's also echoing implicitly into Revelation. So it starts with an oracle directed to the earth in Israel, to the mountains, to the water courses and others. Yahweh speaking, or Yahweh telling Ezekiel to speak directly to the earth. O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot out your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they shall soon come home. Note that the speaking to the earth parts is very similar to Genesis 1, to God telling the earth to separate, etc. And then a similar call from Genesis to increase and be fruitful and multiply. And so I will multiply human beings and animals. So the promise of blessing and fruitfulness. I will sprinkle clean water upon you. Plainly not a baptismal image, because that's a later Christian image, but the sense of purification through clean water, which symbolizes a clean heart, a new heart and a new spirit. And that's certainly similar to Genesis 2:7, when God's spirit enters into the flesh of the earth and it becomes a living being, a nephesh. Remove from your body the heart of stone, which of course in Genesis there was no heart of stone, and my spirit will be put in you. So a recreation story, and the land that was desolate will become like the Garden of Eden. So that's the preface for this. And then in chapter 37 is the vision of dry bones, which many have naively read as if it's a vision of resurrection, but it's not a vision of bodily resurrection. It's an image of a people whose place has been destroyed, and those bones representing those who were left after the battle that led to the exile in the first place and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, now to a post-exilic vision of a restoration. So in his vision here, he's seeing these bones being re-enfleshed, and again, breath to enter you, like we saw here, the Spirit entering you, and put my Spirit, re-emphasizing that. And yet here's one of the differences. My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall have one shepherd. And that's repeated a number of times in this. So Ezekiel's envisioning a restoration of the Davidic covenant as expressed in 2 Samuel 7, a text we'll look at in the Samuel series on Radical Bible. But plainly, John's vision does not have David as king. There is no king, no human king at all. The only shepherd is God. And then a promise of a covenant of peace is everlasting. In my dwelling place, in the Septuagint, using the word kataskenosis, which is parallel in Revelation 21:3 to skene, often translated as dwelling place, but literally tent. I will live according to a tent here, and a verb for tent in your midst shall be with them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people, which John's vision changes to peoples. So it will no longer be Ezekiel's vision of Israel and Judah coming together again as one people, but people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, all worshiping God together, but as many peoples, united but still within their diversity. So those are the setup chapters, and then we get to the prophecy against Gog in the land of Magog. And there's only a brief reference in Revelation 20, verse 8, to Gog and Magog, like they're two people or two entities. And that's certainly to draw attention to Ezekiel. John's vision has nothing really to say about Gog and Magog, and if we didn't know Ezekiel, we just have to ask, what are those things? They're not on any map that we'd have. But plainly, it's showing that John is following this and making at least a passing reference without having to lay out this whole story, which perhaps he didn't even quite understand. So in the beginning of 38, Ezekiel is told to set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, and that I, Yahweh, will lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all clothed in full armor, similar to Revelation 19:19, which you can see right here. And then there's coming down from the sky, fire and sulfur, parallel to Revelation, but really, in many ways, more parallel to Genesis 19, to Sodom and Gomorrah, with the sense of hailstones and sulfur coming from the sky, but still with the destruction based in fire and sulfur. And then the invitation of this banquet, and I put the entire section here because it's so closely parallel to what we see John's vision here in 19, 17, and 18. Speak to the birds of every kind, and then it says, of course, call to all the birds. What Ezekiel has is also to the wild animals, which John does not have. Assemble, come and gather, almost verbatim here, come and gather. You shall eat flesh and drink blood. John leaves out the blood, simply eat the flesh of various peoples. Notice starting again with the mighty and the princes, and then of animals, whereas John's vision has the mighty and then everybody, flesh of all, free and slave, small and great. And so that banquet that's being set up there, and we'll look more closely at that image in a minute. And then after that, which takes place across 2 chapters, Ezekiel 38 and 39, then what takes place across 9 chapters is Ezekiel's vision of a New Jerusalem. And unlike John, he goes into incredible detail from his vision, but notice also the similarities with 21 and 22 in Revelation. He brought me up to a high mountain, which we again see in Revelation 21. Ezekiel sees a structure like a city, which is a little different than what John sees. He will see New Jerusalem coming down out of the sky. A wall all around the outside of the temple area, and we see that also measured in cubits. Most English translations don't have cubits because it's rendered in something that it's a unit that we can understand, but in the Greek, it's using the transliteration of the Hebrew and calling it cubits, just like it does here. And so Revelation doesn't go into the kind of detail, and as we'll see, the temple in Ezekiel is a reasonable size. The temple in Revelation is the cosmic size. And then as part of that, water flows from the temple and it forms a river. And then we see the glory of the God of Israel comes, and there's a sound like many waters. We saw it in Revelation 19:6, but it's also other places. And the earth shone with his glory, and we see the question of the glory of God revealed in New Jerusalem in chapter 21. Then in Ezekiel, we have on the bank of the river, a great many trees on the one side, on the other, whereas in Revelation, there's a single tree, paradoxically described on both sides of the river, which will have fruit all year round. And in Ezekiel's vision, they'll grow all kinds of trees for fruit. And the leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail. They'll bear fruit every month, almost identical to Revelation. And their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. In Revelation 22:2c, as the leaves are for the healing of the nations. Notice that John has taken these 3 sections from 43:2, and from 47:7 and 47:12, and broken them into parts of the single verse 22:2. So Ezekiel is on John's mind, but only when it fits his program. And perhaps part of what he's showing here, just like he showed in the first in the sealed scroll and the small scroll, that the original plan failed, and so now there's a new plan. So in the original scroll, we saw it failed to lead to repentance by threats of punishment that we saw there in Revelation 8 and 9, and that led to the new scroll, which involved witness. And similarly here, the threats of punishment do not lead to that. And the promise of a monarchy in Jerusalem with a temple that had led to exile, John sees as not part of the future. And so there'll be no temple and no king in the New Jerusalem in John's vision. So those are some of the parallels and some of the differences. And that's not all that's echoing into our passage from Hebrew Scripture. We can also see that part of the image, besides these, is from Isaiah. We saw Isaiah up here, and we'll see more of Isaiah, but also from earlier parts of Ezekiel, and this little example of a trope from Deuteronomy, which we can look at the larger version of it, which I didn't put that one in here, but we can see the earliest, apart from the Deuteronomy one that we just saw, is from David and Goliath, where Goliath threatens David, "I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." And we see how that echoes into the Psalm, into Jeremiah, and earlier in Ezekiel, in the passage we just saw in Revelation. So it's a common trope to say, to threaten someone becoming food for the birds, to say your corpses will be left out in shame and will not be buried and not taken care of. And so that's the image we see as we get to this section here. One last thing about this overall, as many scholars have noted, the scene that's in 19:19 through 24, only a little of which we'll look at today, is very closely parallel to the second part of chapter 20, where we see them gathering for battle. The opponents are captured here and destroyed there, and both sides are thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, and they end with the throne vision. So we'll see there's parallels to these 2 battles. And what we can see to answer the question here about the relationship between the war story is that in the war story there, in that temporary period, the beast was given an opportunity to win temporarily, and then there's a resurrection. Just as the empire was allowed to defeat Jesus through crucifixion, and yet God raised him from the dead. So we see the war scenes in in chapter 11 and verse 13 as the equivalent of Jesus' death, except being by his followers and not by Jesus. That those who witnessed non-violently against empire were likely to be killed, and yet that's not the end of the story, that God's power is ultimately more powerful. Let's also look at this question, the relation between the marriage supper of the Lamb and the great supper of God. And so let's look back at verse 9 so we can see the phrasing of that there. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And as I noted at the time, marriage supper invitations or other strong invitations like that often took place in two forms, as we saw from Luke. What we see here to say, fix the date, and then when all things are ready, when the meat is cooked, etc., the final invitation to come. So this is the early invitation, and the final invitation will come in chapter 21, when we see New Jerusalem prepared as a bride. And so that's what happens there. And what happens in our scene in the meantime is the clearing of the space for it. In other words, for there to be this great wedding of the Lamb and of New Jerusalem, parallel to between Yahweh and Israel in the Hebrew Bible, all the opponents have to be cleared out of the way through this throwing into the lake of fire and this consumptive meal by the birds. And yet, Revelation always has the paradox. So even though we saw everybody die in Babylon, yet here they still are. Even though we see them die here, apparently die, although it's again the sword of the mouth, not a physical sword, they're still alive in outside of Revelation, with the gates are open, standing outside, able to come in if they so choose. And so Revelation always has the ambiguity of the already and the not yet, a sort of Schrodinger's cat version of victory and not victory, that God, from God's perspective, has already defeated Babylon and already destroyed evil, and yet from our perspective on earth, the battle seems to still be going on, and even though the outcome has already been fully determined in advance. So let's just look at a couple of the details of our scene before we complete this for the day. So then I saw, and we saw this as the sequence of Chi Adons, the second of 7 in this section, 8 in the larger picture, that leads some scholars to think these are all separate visions, but we don't have to see it that way. So the angel standing in the sun, which is to say in the position of Apollo, which we saw last video. This is a parody of the Apollo with an inscription on his thigh, and the one sitting on the white horse with an inscription on his thigh, replacing Apollo with the Lamb. A loud voice that called to all the birds that fly in mid-heaven, drawing attention to these two earlier times. Let's look at those briefly. In 8:13 we see here an eagle crying with a loud voice that flew in mid-heaven, announcing the 3 woes to the inhabitants of the earth. And in 14:6, another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people, to fear God and give God glory, for the hour of judgment has come. And of course, it was described as coming in 14, but it's actually coming here. So it's a description of mid-heaven, which is to say in the sky above where people can reach, but not so far up as the stars and the sun and the moon, where birds fly, come and gather, echoing Ezekiel, for the great supper of God, the deep nod to mega to theon. Not the marriage supper of the Lamb, but using the same word for supper here. And as my note below says, the feast is of those who have not repented of participation in Babylon, regardless of their social status. So we see, as we've seen other times, including in chapter 6 and 6:15, where those, let's look at that briefly, where the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful, but also everyone, slave and free, hide in fear from the wrath of the angry Lamb. So a parody there. And a similar set of people here who apparently have still not repented are going to become, at least metaphorically, the food for birds. And not yet, that is going to happen, though. It'll happen after this short battle takes place. Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against the rider and his horse against his army. And so the battle's set, and as soon as it's set, it's over. It's over in like part of a verse, as we see. As my notes are below and highlighting what I was saying, it reverses the results at 11:7 and 13:7. And as Ruiz Ortiz notes, the judgments grow in intensity as John shortens their description. So we saw a greater description of what would be happening in the feast and of the preparation. In all just a few verses, the beast was taken captive. Piazzo, only here in Revelation. It's used in John's Gospel as a rest, and that's a similar thing. And with it, the false prophet, who otherwise known as the beast from the land, as we saw back in 13, who performed the signs, and that's, in case we're not sure, that's reminding us, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped. its image. So that's connecting us back to 13. Those two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. And I've always thought it was very similar to this image from Terminator 2. And perhaps I could have saved that for the Satan going into the fire, but maybe I'll just put it again in the next video because I like it so much. So thrown alive in the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. The lake of fire is only here in the Bible. It's in First Enoch and in more obscure Second Enoch. The reference to Ezekiel is not to a lake of fire, but to a furnace of blazing fire, like in Daniel 3, when the three men are thrown into the furnace and yet not killed. And so it's a parallel to the threat against Daniel's friends, but obviously with a very different outcome. Rather than faithful people being protected by God, those who are opposed to God are finally destroyed. And then we get to the last verse of it down here, and the rest, the loipoi, which we'll see them again here, that phrase, the rest, were killed by the sword of the rider on the horse, which is to say, from his mouth, which is to say words. I really want to underscore that again and again, that this is not about a physical battle on earth, but about a metaphorical battle between two ways of being, two messages, the message of empire and the message of the Creator God. And all the birds were gorged with their flesh. Only here in Revelation, but 15 times elsewhere in the New Testament, so as to cause to eat as to become satisfied. And hence the word gorge probably seems too strong. Perhaps we could just translate it, we're satiated with all that flesh. And so that's what we are left with here, is what seems to be, but is not quite, the final destruction of those who had opposed the Lamb and the Lamb's people. And there'll be another angel coming down to announce the final judgment, and that's where we'll go next time, to see that Satan too ends up in the lake of fire. See you then. Bye-bye.